G'day guys, you're listening to Paul Michael, you're tuning in to NeuroPerformance, and this is the fourth video that I've done in the series. We're talking today about the cerebellum. Really is my favourite part of the brain, and the reason why is I've got some little pickies here to show you, is because as you can see on this little picture here, the cerebellum has a massive amount of neurons. Okay, so neurons are the parts of the brain that fire from connection to connection, like the nerves in the brain. And the neurons in the cerebellum amount to about 80% of all the neurons in the entire brain. Now the cerebellum, if you can see, it's just down here. It's about 10% of the whole brain weight. And the weight of the cerebellum is really only like 160 grams, 200 grams, give or take. For that to have 80% of all the neurons in the brain, you've got to start giving it some credit and start thinking, well, this thing's actually pretty important. And till recently, we've always thought that the cerebellum is just really coordination and balance and eyes and that sort of stuff. But we're starting to learn that the cerebellum is now involved with motor learning, organisation of thoughts, and it's really closely linked to the frontal lobe. So that frontal pontine cerebellar link means that the frontal lobe and the cerebellum are very hardwired. And if you think of the frontal lobe as the executive manager, the cerebellum really is the line manager that comes in and makes sure that the task that the frontal lobe has decided it wants to do is going to get carried out. And it really is that middleman that looks at sending all the information to the muscles and coordinating and synchronizing each muscle and telling each muscle exactly what timing it needs to start moving in a sequence of movements for a reaching task. For example, it has information coming in from the eyes, it has information coming in from the vestibular part or the motion sensors in the inner ear, and it has information coming up from the body. The spinocerebellar tract, as the name suggests, is spine to cerebellum, takes in a lot of the proprioception or joint position information. So it integrates all that sort of stuff and gives an output that is a quality control around movement. And when we talk about sports performance or athletic performance, we then have to start thinking the cerebellum is pretty important, right? Now, what other pictures have I got? So that's where he sits on the brain there. Okay, so that highlighted part or that red part. And if we look at the brain stem there, we can see a cross section of the cerebellum here as it's been cut open, and then the middle part of the brain stem here, which is the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain, which are, like I was saying a couple of videos ago, are really the older parts to the brain. So there's a lot of integration of sensors happening at the cerebellum. But possibly the most important part of the cerebellum is what's called the flocconodular lobe, or the vestibulocerebellum, which is the part of the brain or part of the cerebellum that integrates head movement with eyes, okay, and really looks after our ability to keep focused on a target while our bodies or our heads moving, okay. And so if that process is not really working very well, then what happens when we move is that our eyes really start to feel like they're losing track of target, and we become unsteady. And because that process is so fickle and it can easily be weakened, if we're losing our eye and head coordination, then we're also going to start losing spinal stability. Okay, so that vestibulo-ocular reflex and that ability for us to coordinate eye movements and head movements is essential with the cerebellum, or is essential with performance. Now, the other parts of the cerebellum that we're talking about here, if we look at this screen here, we've got one in pink, which is our spinocerebellum, and it regulates muscle tone, is coordination of skilled movement. Okay, so the ability to change directions quite quickly, the ability to coordinate non-linear movements a lot of the time. And then we've got our blue part here, which is more planning of voluntary movement. Like I said, the cerebellum really takes in the instructions from the frontal lobe and puts them into a really neat little plan that actually can be carried out. And the cerebellum is is certainly involved with regulation of posture, okay, in particular all your extensor muscles, so they're muscles that pull your shoulder blades back and muscles that work around the back of our hips. And of course those muscles are primary importance for limb movement, okay. So the cerebellum really has to coordinate the muscles through the spine to then the shoulder blade, to then the shoulder, then to the elbow, to the wrist, in a good sequence for us to have good movement. And when it's doing that properly, we've got good synergy, and our ability to reach out and touch something without a tremor is an old-fashioned and very, very common classic cerebellum test, which is our finger to nose. And we watch that, how smooth that can be, and if we start to see a breakdown in movement there or a little tremor, we know that cerebellum is not working very well. So the cerebellum also coordinates eye movements, okay. So as we know, the eyes have little muscles behind them, and just as we're coordinating movements of the body with the cerebellum, it also takes in input that's coming in through the eyes in form of visual input, and then depending on where we want to move our attention to, will enable us to move there accurately, or might, if it's not working very well, start to see with eye movements that it's moving there inaccurately, so it might jump past the target instead of coming to the target with the eye movements. It also enables us to smoothly follow a target, okay. So we've got smooth pursuits and our ability to stay locked on that target, and then we've got saccades where we're going from one target to the other target. And now, of course, if these movements are inaccurate or unsmooth or choppy, well, they start to look like they need a little bit of help from the head when we're turning, when we're looking from target to target, then we might have to start cleaning up these movements from the cerebellum. As of course, if we've got choppy eye movements and slow or inaccurate eye movements, then the sensory information coming in is going to mean we're going to have a poor output, which is the motor output or the movement going out. So the cerebellum is super important for all these things. So it's my favourite part of the brain, like I said. Training the cerebellum really comes down to looking at all the different inputs that are coming in and working out whether or not those inputs are quality. So are we getting quality visuals coming through? Are our eyes aligned? Are we getting quality vestibular information coming through? Have we had some problems with the inner ear before, or if we had a recent cold, which means we might not be coordinating very well, or we might not be getting good sensory input from the vestibular, into the brain, or are we not getting great sensory input coming up from the spinocerebellar tract in the form of proprioception? And if all these things aren't coming in properly, then it's going to make it hard for that side or both sides of the cerebellum to coordinate for a good smooth movement, accurate movement, controlled synergistic movement as an output, okay. Think about a ball coming towards us. The eyes have to see that. The frontal lobe then has to say, I want to catch that. The cerebellum then has the plan and says, okay, where's our body to begin with? Okay, let's now start moving towards that ball, because that's what the frontal lobe has told us we're supposed to do. And then if that ball's coming towards us, the visual input that the cerebellum is getting in real time and tells the cerebellum to tell the muscles, so that it can tell the muscles when to move out and when to stop in the pathway of that ball in order to catch it at the right time, okay. And so that's what the cerebellum enables. If we didn't have that, the frontal lobe would say catch the ball, and the movement would look something like that, and the ball would be gone, okay. So the cerebellum really refines that quality movement and makes it able to stop right as the ball comes there. So it's a really cool part of the brain, and a part that I like to train for high performance for any athlete, okay. And once again, the fact that it's got 80% of all the neurons in the brain has to give it some credit. So that's the cerebellum, guys. Next time I think we're going to start working on the autonomic nervous system, or I'll start explaining the autonomic nervous system, the two arms to that, so stay tuned.